Okay, and we are ready. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Once again, my name is Sana. I am the social media coordinator for CAIR-Missouri. Welcome to our Know Your Rights series, episode 1. The topic for today is, why is the Bill of Rights still important today? And we are welcomed by Philip Robertson. He is a trial attorney at CAIR Chicago, and our very own Associate Executive Director, Marwan Hamid.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you, Sana. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, fellow, for taking the time to talk to us about the importance of the Bill of Rights. Many of our community members and many of the people actually I meet in my everyday life, when I talk to them about the civil rights, I got the impression that this is a very secondary issue that they should worry about or think about until they face some sort of confrontation with a law enforcement discriminatory treatment, or at a job or at the school. Then at that time they kind of feel how important it is to learn about at least their civil rights and what are they entitled to according to the Constitution. So once again, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about the importance of the Bill of Rights. And I would like to give you the time here to present yourself and a little bit of background about you, and then talk to us about the importance of the Bill of Rights.
Sure. My name is Phil Robertson. I am the litigation director at CAIR Chicago. I've been in that position since September 2015, a little over 6 years. And in the 6 years, I have had many opportunities to address the topic of the Bill of Rights and why it is still so essential for us today, living in our society as we are here in the United States. The context of the Bill of Rights comes into play in many different scenarios. As Marwan had mentioned, it arrives to us sometimes as we're walking down the street and we're approached by law enforcement. Sometimes we're involved in activism or protest and we're approached by law enforcement. Sometimes there are issues that we have at our home, in our neighborhood, with other neighbors or with law enforcement. And then, of course, sometimes at work, there are issues there that are impacted by the Bill of Rights. And then most notably, when we travel and when we have issues with crossing the border and coming into the United States or leaving the United States. And then sometimes the immigration benefits that are attached there too are also somewhat impacted. So it's a very interesting piece of legislation. And I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background about how we got where we are today. Approximately 6 years ago, the founding fathers got together and realized that they did not want to be subjected to the tyrannical rule of the British monarchy anymore. So what they did is they decided to put together a government that would avoid the pitfalls and hassles that came along with being part of a monarchy in the United Kingdom, in England. When they left England back in the 16 and 1700s, it was their goal to set up a new type of country where a king was not a ruler, and the king could not by imperial fiat impose his will and impose punishments, etc., on the subjects of the monarchy, whimsically, arbitrarily, or capriciously. So when they came here, they drafted the Constitution, but before they were able to address all of the issues that were in the Constitution, there were people who said, well, wait a minute, this Constitution sets up a great form of government. However, there are some issues that we have with some of the individual liberties that don't seem to be addressed by this Constitution. So when the Constitution was circulated throughout the states put together what they would consider to be their amendments to the Constitution. And those first 10 amendments we call the Bill of Rights. So when you look at the Bill of Rights, understand that it's basically the way that the people tried to make sure that there was balance between the powers of the government and the powers of the individual, and the rights and the responsibilities of both. So there are individual liberties that are spelled out within the Bill of Rights. And that was one of the biggest things that the states were concerned about, is they wanted to make sure that when the government took over, the government was not going to be in a position to arbitrarily impose its will upon the citizenry of the United States. So when you look at the Bill of Rights, you'll notice that they are tilted in favor of granting rights to individual citizens and removing some of the power away from government. And so that's why it was so very important at that time, because they did not want to go back to the same type of government and the same type of rule that they had in England. So when we look at the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments, there are a couple of the amendments that I'm going to focus on here specifically. The first, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth amendments. Those have a very large bearing on what we do today. It doesn't mean that the other ones don't. It just means that in the limited time that we have, it would be good to understand these amendments and what protections they provide to individuals as we go forward. There are involved in those types of amendments, individual liberties that we possess. So when you look at, for example, the First Amendment, there are rights that imbue to everybody, that are applied to everybody. So these are not rights that are unique to certain people. They're unique to everybody. Every individual in the United States has these rights. Even if you're not a U.S. citizen, you still have some rights under the U.S. Constitution. And, depending on what context you arrive at, the Bill of Rights may provide you some very good protection, even if you are not a U.S. citizen. So when we look at the Bill of Rights, we think about, oh, well, this is just for citizens. It's not just always for U.S. citizens. And then when we look a little further into it, we also see that, there are specific liberties that are spelled out, and they're done so because they address specific problems that the British monarchy was imposing upon the citizens and the people of the 1700s. These problems would have persisted and still do persist today, but would have persisted in even greater fashion had we not had the Bill of Rights and the first 10 amendments. So under the First Amendment, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So when you unpack that, there's a lot of separate individual liberties in that particular First Amendment. So the first one being freedom of religion, the second one being freedom of speech, the third one being freedom of press, and fourth one being the right to assemble peaceably, and the fifth one being the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Looking at these now, how are they applicable today? Well, we see the freedom of religion issue come up quite frequently in our work at CAIR Chicago. We are often faced with a situation where an individual has been discriminated against because of their religion, or because of their race, or because of their national origin. In particular, we see that in employment contexts. We see that in situations where public accommodations are denied, public benefits are denied, and it's specifically because of someone's religion or their race or their national origin. one of the things that the First Amendment does is it prohibits the establishing of a religion. So the government can't say everybody has to be Christian, or everybody has to be Jewish, or everybody has to be Muslim, or anything. There can not be any laws that are made by the U.S. government that will basically establish some sort of national religion. But oftentimes we see things that come close to that. Even today, we see bills that pop up in the General Assembly that will put certain favoritized treatment toward one particular religion or another. And a good example of that is when you see public funding going to predominantly Catholic or Christian schools. We see that sometimes in legislation where states will try to move money basically out of the public coffers and then into a particular type of religion's school district or school, parish, etc. And so when we see that, we look at the First Amendment and say, well, are they trying to establish a religion here? But the other times we see freedom of religion challenged is when we see things like beard laws in employment, where someone is requiring someone to trim or remove their facial hair because they feel that there might be some issue, but yet they don't let us know what the issue is. They simply say it has to be done. And generally it's done out of a discriminatory bias against people who are of the Muslim faith. We also see that occurring right now with COVID. There are a number of people who are seeking exemptions based on religion. And so there are employers out there who unfortunately will say, well, I don't think that that's a good enough reason. You got to go get your vaccine. So they're denying the religious exemption, and those cases end up coming to us, and then we have to contact the employer and say, look, the religious exemption is provided by law, so you have to honor that and you have to accommodate them per their request. We oftentimes see requests for accommodation in employment, things like being able to take Eid off without using paid time off. We also see it in the context of school districts where someone might request an accommodation for Ramadan or for some other religious holiday, and unfortunately the accommodation is denied for whatever reason. So we oftentimes have to work with school districts and employers to get these accommodations granted. And then sometimes the pushback is, well, we don't want to give favoritized treatment to persons of the Muslim faith because then we feel like we're establishing a religion. And a lot of times those are basically just unfounded hypotheses or theories, and they're really not the basis of the action. The basis is usually rooted in anti-Muslim bias or discrimination. And so we have to overcome that and say, look, no, you're actually impeding their right to freely practice their religion. So you are in fact violating the First Amendment because you are impacting their ability to freely worship. So we see that a lot in the employment context, but again, we see it in other contexts as well. We had an issue just recently where someone was trying to pray in a library. All they wanted to do was just be able to go and pray quietly, and they were asked to leave the library because they were praying in the library. So we had to work with the library district to explain to them that this is part of their free practice of religion and it should not be impeded upon. Another area where we see it is prisons. Unfortunately, there are many Muslim inmates who are being denied halal food meals in public prisons in Illinois right now. We have a lawsuit pending right now where we're trying to get that changed, at least for on the halal food issue. But there are other issues as well that they struggle with. For example, there are issues with Jummah prayer, any type of group prayer. We see issues with them getting prayer space, prayer space requests being denied, requests for imams being denied, articles of faith such as kufis and prayer rugs and prayer beads being confiscated and not returned for no reason. So we see these issues arise fairly regularly in the prison context. When we go a little further down there into the First Amendment, you see freedom of speech, and then also the freedom to assemble and petition for redress of grievances. Those kind of get linked hand in hand now because of the activism that we see out in the general public. So we see a lot of times people who want to express themselves, and they do so peaceably. So they go to voice their opinion by going to a protest or a rally or something along those lines. And at that point, then they end up getting approached by law enforcement. So the questions then become, well, what rights do I have when I'm there and I'm trying to, basically just exercise my First Amendment rights, but here I am being approached by police officers. So when we talk about that, there are some other of the first 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights that come into play. So one of the first ones that we looked at is the Fourth Amendment, which basically says that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue except upon probable cause. So what that says basically is that if you are walking down the street, police officers aren't permitted to simply just walk up to you and start searching you and say, oh, give me your purse, or oh, give me your laptop, or oh, give me your phone. Those would be considered unreasonable searches and seizures under the Fourth Amendment. So
Robert, oh no, Philip, I can't hear you.
Is it probably the internet?
in and out of
No.
O'Hare, or when you're going in and out of Midway, there may be times where you are stopped and you are asked to provide your phone, or you are asked to provide your laptop to the Customs and Border Patrol officer or a TSA agent, or they may actually take you into a room and detain you and search you. Again, there is a lot of latitude and discretion, unfortunately, that has been given to the courts by Customs and Border Protection and to TSA to allow those types of searches. However, it doesn't mean that you are without remedies. There are things that we can do afterwards to try and have the situation investigated and looked into if there are problems. So one of the things that we often will be asked is, well, what can we do afterwards after we've been searched and had our property taken from us? One of the things that we do is we recommend filing complaints with Department of Homeland Security, TSA, Customs and Border Protection, and Department of Transportation. Those complaints will then spur an investigation into the incident to find out whether or not it was warranted, whether the detention was warranted, whether the interrogation was warranted, and whether the confiscation of the phone and laptop was warranted. Unfortunately, right now, the way the courts have read these or allowed these permissive actions to occur, it's still not advisable for you to say no if they ask you for your laptop or your phone or your password. We had been seeing over the past year instances where people's phones were being confiscated and removed completely, taken away for weeks at a
I think there's a slight internet connection problem.
can object to that, but be advised that because of the way the courts have ruled, unfortunately, the TSA agent or the CBP agent at that point would then have the ability to say, no, we're not going to permit you to leave the country or come into the country, whichever it is. They may simply detain you, and then they may continue to interrogate you at that point. We are working on some legislation that would fix that, that would change that situation so that that doesn't happen quite so frequently at the border. But getting back to the situation where we are at the protest, in that situation, you should never just simply hand over your purse or your laptop or your phone just because a police officer asked you for it. There are things that they are required to do, and we're going to cover those in just a little minute. But I wanted to see, does anybody have any questions about the First or Fourth Amendment at this point?
No questions yet. We usually do the Q&A towards the end.
Okay.
But if something pops up,
I do have a question actually.
Sure.
If I may ask. So it's more of a clarification than a question. So when you first, going back to your first introduction of the Bill of Rights, those amendments were found to balance the power of the government or the relation between the government and the people, not to balance the power between the three branch of the governments. Basically, that's to clarify to other people. That's the difference.
Correct.
Okay.
It was to balance between the rights of the individual and the responsibilities and duties of the government.
Got you. And with regards to the Fourth Amendment, it's kind of tricky if you're protesting in the street versus you're traveling overseas and coming back to the United States, where the TSA and the CPP have a different tab of discretion of searching your belongings and asking you for your laptop and devices. Yeah.
Correct. And that is, that's the one thing that I would underscore is that in those contexts, there is a different level of discretion that is permitted. When it's local law enforcement simply walking up to you because you're at a protest or a rally or whatever, they have much less discretion because of the fact that they need to be able to satisfy the requirements of the Fourth Amendment. So the Fourth Amendment says that, you need probable cause. Basically, they would need, first of all, probable cause to stop and approach you to say, okay, why are you here? What are you doing? What role do you have here? What's your business here? Probable cause has been kind of more specifically defined as, a reasonably articulable suspicion of wrongdoing. So as long as the officer can provide a reasonably articulable suspicion about why they stopped you, that would satisfy probable cause. But it needs to be more than something other than he looked funny, or I didn't like the way he looked, or I don't like the way any of these people look. That gets you into the area of what we call profiling, where officers will be looking at someone in particular and say, oh, okay, well, there's a risk of, possibly some sort of terror situation going on at the rally. And so we're going to start looking for anybody who is wearing a hijab or a kufi or anything along those lines, because we want to basically eliminate any threat from the Muslim community. That would be considered targeting or profiling. And targeting is basically where law enforcement is looking at you because you fit a certain profile, and they are going to continue to interrogate you and detain you based on just that information. So that has been stricken in courts all across the country. So law enforcement is not permitted to target or profile based on someone's nationality or skin color or religion or religious headwear that they're wearing or anything along those lines. If you're wearing a niqab or hijab or anything like that, you should not be subjected to any more scrutiny than anybody else is at the rally or the protest. And then that kind of gets us into the Fifth Amendment, because at some point, there may be times where you want to answer the questions of an officer. And so one of the things that we talk about is whether or not you actually have the obligation to answer their questions. And most of the time the answer is you don't have an obligation to answer their questions, but you do have, you can, if you want to, answer questions, and comply and work with law enforcement. So we don't want to be in a position where we're encouraging people to not work with law enforcement or cooperate with law enforcement. But if you are going to be interrogated
Yeah, it stopped again. I don't know what's happening.
across, all across the country, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, then an attorney will be provided to you by the state. Do you understand these rights? And so at that point, what they're telling you is, if you're in custody, you don't have to talk to the law enforcement officer anymore. You can simply say, I will speak to you once my lawyer is present. And so that is, something that is important to keep in mind, because if the officer says, no, you're not in custody, then you're free to walk away, and you don't have to answer any more of their questions or cooperate with them or work with them in any capacity at all. You can if you want to. And again, we encourage people to continue to work with law enforcement as they see necessary and fit. But if they're simply just asking you a bunch of questions and you don't feel comfortable answering them, if you ask them if you're in custody and they say no, then you can say, okay, well, I'd rather not answer any more questions, and you can simply walk away at that point. So that, is something that a lot of people don't realize, is that they do have the freedom to not answer questions for law enforcement, that they can walk away from a police officer if they're approached on the street about that.
I have a question, actually. I'm sorry. I have a question. What if you're on the street and the police officer comes up to you and starts asking you questions, and they ask for your ID,
Mm-hmm.
and then you hand them your ID, and you're getting uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, and you ask, am I in custody? And they say no, then what do? Do you walk away, or do you wait for them to give you your license? Or because sometimes they hold on to your ID and they continue asking you questions.
Right. And they can ask you for your ID. They can ask you for identification. You can provide them identification, but you're not required to answer any of the questions for them. I mean, as far as I understand, you're not even required to provide them an ID. There are state laws that say that that's not even permissible, but it's different from state to state. So there are situations where you may not even have to do that. But again, we want to encourage people to not be basically obstructionist. But if at some point after you hand them your ID, because you felt, okay, I'll give them my ID, and now they start asking you questions like, oh, do you worship at a mosque around here? And, where do you go? And who else do you talk to? And have you traveled out of the country recently? And who did you go see? And where did you go? And how long were you there? You don't have to answer any of those questions. You can simply say, I'm not comfortable answering that right now. If you want to talk to me any further, I'll be happy to answer any questions with the presence of my lawyer. And if I'm not in custody, then I'm going to be leaving. And you can do that because this is the United States, and that's what these rights guarantee, that you are able to do that and not have to be subjected to endless interrogation just because of the color of your skin or the religion that you follow or the country that you came from.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, it does.
So, yeah, like I said, that's a good segue into the Fifth Amendment, because the Fifth Amendment basically says you have the right to remain silent. Actually, I'm going to call it up right here. It's no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment in a grand jury. No person shall be subjected to for the same offense to twice, so basically the double jeopardy rule. Nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that's a very important phrase right there, without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So there is, under the Fifth Amendment, those particular rights, guaranteeing due process, which basically means that you have to be permitted notice and an opportunity to be heard if you're being accused of something. So they have to provide you with what's called a bill of indictment, which says this are the crimes that you've committed, and then you need to be permitted an opportunity to respond to that and defend yourself. But the Fifth Amendment also covers the right to remain silent. It also says, the right to not answer questions or not to have to answer questions when you're asked by a police officer or a government agent. You have the right to remain silent. You don't have to continue answering questions, and that means before or after you're in custody. If you're not in custody, then clearly you have the right to not answer any of their questions, and you can simply advise them that you're going to walk away and you're not going to answer any more questions. Then they should at that point stop questioning you. If they don't, then you have to let them know politely that you will continue to answer any questions in the presence of your attorney. And if they're saying that you are now in custody, then you should stop answering any questions and stop talking to them until your attorney is present. So once you've advised them that you don't want to answer any more questions, and once you advise them that you will only do so in the presence of your lawyer, then you need to stop talking to them and tell them that you will continue to respond, but you will only do so when your lawyer is present. So that is a really important point for us to remember, because you're guaranteed a right to an attorney. And you have the right to talk to that law enforcement or the attorney before you answer any further questions to law enforcement. So usually what we advise people is that if they're in this context and they are stopped by law enforcement at a rally or a protest or just on the street, and they've advised the law enforcement officer to stop questioning them, and they did, then they should still go out and contact their attorney and let their attorney know what happened. And say, talk to their lawyer and say, well, they were asking me about X, Y, and Z. Should I continue to talk to them, or should I hold off, or should we only talk to them if you are present with me? And it's always a good idea to get that kind of review from your lawyer before you do have any further conversations with law enforcement. Because you want to just make sure that you're not doing anything that's going to incriminate yourself. In other words, you don't want to be talking to law enforcement and then they say, oh, well, we didn't realize that you had this place over in so-and-so. Well, now we want to ask you questions about that. And then all of a sudden now you are in a position where, unfortunately, you have to explain a lot of different things that you shouldn't have to explain about. But now because you've done that without your advice of counsel, you may be in a position where you might have some liability. And so that's why we always say, don't talk to law enforcement until you've spoken to a lawyer. And when you are talking to law enforcement, have your lawyer present there when you do so. And that goes for FBI contacts, that goes for Department of Homeland Security, anybody else who reaches out to you after you're back in the country. It could be anybody from like your local law enforcement. It could be state police. It could be county sheriffs, anybody. So it applies to everybody. We see it quite frequently in Chicago with FBI contacts. We have many clients who are contacted by the FBI and they want to just come and talk to them for a few minutes, they say. And so what we'll do is we will reach out to the FBI agent and try and get a sense of what it is they want to meet with our client about. What are the topics they want to discuss? What is it that they're looking into? Is our client the target of an investigation? Are they the subject of an investigation? Is there any reason for them to be concerned about, whether there could be some criminal liability here? And many times, unfortunately, the FBI agents are kind of close-lipped about it. They won't give us very much information. They'll tell us essentially, well, I can kind of give you some general information, but I can't give you specifics. But even through that, if we can find out whether or not they're a target or a subject, that's helpful. And if we can find out the general nature of the questioning, that's helpful. And if we can find out the source of the questioning, that's also helpful, because sometimes they're just acting on an anonymous tip, and they just simply need to follow up on the tip and the lead to kind of close all the loops on the file and then get the file closed. So sometimes it can be fairly innocuous. I've been doing these for, like I say, about 6 years, and we rarely had a situation where it developed into something more than we thought it was going to be. And when I say that, I mean that basically the FBI came back to them and wanted to talk to them again. That's happened. I've done dozens and dozens of these, and that's happened maybe once or twice. So it's fairly infrequently that the FBI will want to come back. So in that instance, though, when we meet with them and we talk to them, I am present in the room. I'm sitting there next to the client. The FBI agents are there. We're all taking notes about which questions were asked and what the answers that were given, so that we have a record that we can go back to if the FBI comes back to us and says later on, oh yeah, you said that you traveled from April of 2017 to May of 2018, but we found out that wasn't correct. So now we want you to cooperate with us and work with us because we think that you were lying to us. This way we can go back and we can look at our notes and we can verify, no, that wasn't the answer that we gave. We actually said this. And so it's always good to have that attorney present, if for nothing else than to be a witness to what is being said and what is being requested by the FBI. So, and the answers that are being given by the client. So we always advise that, and that is, important regardless of how you come upon the particular instance of being approached by law enforcement. Now, if you don't have a lawyer, like someone who is on retainer, you can still tell the officer that you would like to speak to a lawyer before you answer any questions. So you can simply say, I don't want to answer any further questions at this time. I would prefer just to be able to speak to my lawyer and then contact you after that. There's also public defenders who are available to you if you're not able to acquire an attorney on your own. There's always a public defender that you can avail yourself of to be present when you're being questioned by law enforcement. And of course, contact us, CAIR. CAIR always is able to come to your side to help you in these types of situations. But interestingly, it is a situation that a lot of people find themselves in, and find themselves answering questions. So as many times as I've given this presentation and made these remarks, we still have clients saying, yes, I talked to them. They came to my house. We met with them for about 30 to 45 minutes, and we talked about all these different things. And they say, and now they want to talk to me again. So can you help me? And my response is, unfortunately, at this point, probably not, because you've already disclosed a bunch of things to them. I don't even know what they are. And, they know what they are because they took notes when you were answering the questions, but you probably didn't when you were answering the questions. So they know a lot of things already, and I don't. And so myself or any other attorney stepping into that role is going to have a hard time helping you out under those circumstances, because we don't know what questions were asked. We don't know what answers were given. We don't know at this point, what things were said or documented. And so it gets very difficult for us to do our job at that point, because unfortunately, as they say, the cat's already been taken out of the bag. So it gets a little hard to defend in that situation. It doesn't necessarily mean you're out of relief. It just means that it's a more difficult situation.
There's a question.
Thank you so much for, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for bringing that point. I'm sorry, Sana. It's actually very important. We see that in CAIR-Missouri as well. People tends to be more friendly and talk to the law enforcement and answer, even giving answers that they were never asked. And that's kind of get them into, in a situation where we don't know what has been discussed and what was told. So I really appreciate that you mentioned and bring that point. And I have a follow-up question here. Does law enforcement allow to lie to you when it comes to if you ask them if you're in custody or not to get an answer from you? Like, are they allowed to tell you that you're not in custody, but actually you are in custody?
No, because as soon as they are going to take you into custody, they do have to provide you with Miranda rights. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to try and ask you a bunch of questions, even when you say, well, I don't want to answer, and you start walking away, or you say, well, I'll only answer after I've talked to my attorney. They might still try and talk to you, but once you've said that to them, that you don't want to answer any further questions, or you don't want to answer them without your attorney present, they should stop questioning you. So as to whether or not they can tell you you are in custody when you're not, they wouldn't do that because they would have to Mirandize you. And then at that point, you would know you're in custody, and then you would just simply request an attorney. But whether they would tell you that you're not when you actually are, I haven't seen that come up. I suppose it's possible that they could just to try and say, oh, well, you're not in custody, so you can keep answering our questions. But even at that point, the red flag should go off in your head that, I don't have my attorney present here. I don't have any witnesses to this conversation at all. I don't know, how this information is going to be used against me. So I really need to kind of take a step back and say, well, I don't really want to answer these questions at this point. Whether I'm in, and if I am in custody, then I definitely don't want to answer any of these questions unless my attorney is present. So I think it's very important that you make it clear to them that, if they say, oh, well, you're not in custody, then, and they keep asking you questions, and you say, okay, well, I'm not interested in answering any more questions at this time, unless I'm in custody. And if I'm in custody, then please Mirandize me. And then at that point, the red light should go off to say, okay, I need to have my attorney present before I say anything else to the officers, so I don't incriminate myself.
Gotcha.
There's a question on Facebook. How responsive is the FBI to you when you reach out to them?
They're pretty responsive. In fact, what we do when the client calls us and says that they've been contacted by the FBI, the first thing we ask, after we've kind of gotten the rundown of the facts, is we ask if the officer left them a card with their name and phone number on it. And if so, then what we can do is what we will do is then we'll talk to the client about, the pros and cons of meeting with the FBI. And then we'll reach out to the FBI agent directly and say, okay, you spoke to this person, or you contacted this person, you wanted to meet with them. What is it about? And we'll do that fairly regularly. And the FBI agents, as long as they leave their card and their phone number, they always get back to us. So I've never had an agent where it was like they left their card and their phone number and I called them and they just never responded. That doesn't happen. There are some situations, however, where someone will be approached and they simply say, well, I don't want to talk to an FBI agent. And the agent from wherever agency they're from doesn't leave a card or a phone number or anything. In that instance, we can't really follow up because we don't know who it was that contacted them or approached them. So it's, in that situation, there isn't a lot we can do. But most of the time, at least in Chicago, they are pretty good about leaving their card and their phone number. And then I just directly reach out to them. And it's interesting too, since I've been doing this 6 years now, I know a lot of the agents personally because we've had many of these what we call informal interviews, informal contacts. So I know a lot of them, so I can kind of pick up the phone and say, hey, what's going on in this particular case? And it usually, because they know me, it gets me a little more information than they might just give some stranger off the street or some attorney that they haven't worked with before. So, but I think that's one of the things that has been really good about, my working at CAIR. I think I've really helped build that relationship to the point where if I really need to know about something, how much is going on in this case and what's really going on, what's behind it, I can sometimes get that information. Now, every once in a while, you get a new agent and they're like really reluctant. They're like, no, I can't tell you anything. All I can tell you is that we want to talk to them. So, once in a while we get that too, but then usually what I'll do is I'll go back to the client and say, they won't tell us what they want to talk to you about. They won't tell us why they contacted you. They won't tell me if you're a target. They won't tell me if you're a subject. So my advice is, since they're not requiring you to meet with them, I don't see any upside for you to meet with them. So I would advise you to decline the interview, and then we go back to the agent and we let them know that they're not interested in talking to them at this time.
Okay.
So, and then I want to just quickly I know we're coming short on time, but I wanted to quickly touch on Sixth Amendment because there are times where people are taken into custody, and then they need to know, okay, well, if I'm in custody, then what are my rights at that point? And once you get into custody, then, there are certain things that are guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment. For example, the right to a speedy and public trial. People say, oh my gosh, these trials and criminal procedures, they take years and years and years. No, typically they have to try a criminal case in 120 days unless the defendant requests more time. Like sometimes the defendant's attorneys will want more time to do discovery, like maybe take some depositions of the officers or request some written documents or other things that haven't been included in the initial discovery exchange. So a lot of times when we see, like in the Rittenhouse case, that happened last year, and the trial just occurred now. Well, that was clearly, obviously, past 120 days since the crime occurred or since he was taken into custody. And in that instance, he was granted bail, so he was able to bond out and not be in prison all that time. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't get that break. And unfortunately, a lot of our clients do not have the means to afford the bail that gets applied. Now, in Illinois, one of the things that we did over the last year in the General Assembly is we started eliminating cash bond for a lot of the criminal offenses. I think there's only a few now where cash bond is required to make bail. Which is good because we saw a lot of people who were, getting stuck in the system and, their cases would linger on for whatever, and there would be no speedy and public trial. They would be basically sitting in prison for a while just because delay. But the Sixth Amendment is put in place so that you can basically assure that you do have that right and you are guaranteed that right under the Constitution. And then you're to be tried by an impartial jury wherein the crime was committed, and to be being fully informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, and to be confronted with the witnesses against you. So they have to be able to bring in the witnesses, marshal the evidence, and you have a right to cross-examine the witnesses. You have a right to object to the witnesses. You have a right to counter the witnesses with your own witnesses and your own evidence. And then, and to do so, you have the ability to subpoena people. So you can call people into court to defend you on your case. And those are all provided by the Sixth Amendment, as well as having assistance of counsel in your defense of the crime. And so one of the important things to keep in mind is that even once you get into custody, the Bill of Rights is there to protect you because there are these provisions put in place that allow us to have a more fair and impartial jury system. Now, it doesn't always play out, and it certainly doesn't play out in every case and every trial, but that's one of the reasons that we have the Sixth Amendment in place, is to make sure that even people who are in custody are given certain inalienable rights that they can rely upon that will hopefully ensure that justice is done. I was going to end with that, but I will, and because I know we only have a few minutes left for questions, but just going back to why silence is a virtue. One of the things that I apologize, I have a PowerPoint that I wasn't able to load, so I'm looking at it right now. But they oftentimes will tell you, no, you're not in trouble. We just have a few questions about Mr. So-and-so or when you travel to wherever. They oftentimes will not disclose the full purpose of their investigation. They won't tell you, oh, this is why we're asking these questions, or, oh, we just want to know this or that or the other because we're just checking out the neighborhood or whatever. they generally won't give you that information. It's kind of like when I go back to the FBI agents and say, well, why is it you want to talk to Mr. So-and-so? Many of the agents will just say, oh, well, we got this anonymous tip, or we got this lead that we're following up. Some of them will be very general and vague. One of the things you have to remember is that you can't be harmed for not talking to police. They can't say, oh, well, you're not answering questions, well, you're going to be under arrest. But believe it or not, that happens in a lot of other countries. If you don't respond, if you don't give them your ID, if you don't answer every question, they will take you into custody right there, just simply for not answering the questions. That can't happen here in the United States. If you don't want to answer the questions, you're free to walk away as long as you're not in custody. And if you are in custody, or even if you're not, you can simply say, I would prefer to do this in the presence of my lawyer. So those are things that are important points to keep in mind. But just remember that your activities, your political activities, your religious activities are protected by the Constitution. And, they are, the police and the FBI are kind of trained in interrogation techniques. So one of the things you don't want to do is try to do a battle of wits with them. If you feel that you're being questioned improperly, call CAIR. Call us, let us know, and we will follow up and pursue it. But that's why the Bill of Rights is so important today, because it impacts so many aspects of our daily life. Just walking down the street, in schools, in the employment context, when you're traveling, even in certain immigration interviews, we see this come up quite a bit. Were you ever arrested? Were you ever convicted of a crime? Tell us about those types of things. Some of that is relevant to their inquiry. Some of it is not. Some of it is plainly not relevant to whether or not you get an employment authorization document. So these are things that come up in so many different contexts, and it's important to remember that you have rights, and you're not required to answer all of these questions by law enforcement simply because they've asked them of you.
There are a couple of questions on Facebook. Can you please explain what rights immigrants have under the U.S. Constitution?
Yeah, immigrants I think what you mean is non-U.S. citizens. Immigrants who would be like LPRs, basically green card holders, have all the same rights as U.S. citizens. Anybody who's been nationalized, basically who's gotten past the citizenship application and gotten it approved, you would have all the rights of a U.S. citizen. The ones that are a little trickier are people who are here and not U.S. citizens. They're basically here on like a non-immigrant visa, or they're what's considered undocumented, or they're out of status. So for those individuals, there are still rights that apply. In particular, those first, fifth, fourth, fifth, and sixth amendments, those still apply even to non-citizens. So when someone is picked up by ICE, they still have the right to remain silent. They still have the right to an attorney. They still have a right to a fair and impartial speedy trial. They still have the right to not be unfairly searched and seized. So all of those things, they have a right to not incriminate themselves. So all of those rights still apply, even if you are an undocumented person or a non-U.S. citizen.
Okay, under what circumstances FBI would contact someone?
There's a myriad of circumstances where they would contact someone, but usually what happens is they are acting on a tip from somebody, and it's sometimes an anonymous tip, but sometimes it's not an anonymous tip. For us, it's almost impossible for us to get to the source of where the tip came from. But some agents will share that it came in on like an anonymous tip line, or it could be something that they're following up on from another file or another case. They could say, well, we're looking into another matter and this person's name came up, and we just want to talk to them and see how they know this person and what their relationship is with this person. So that's one thing. Some of the things that trigger FBI contacts, though, are travel. Travel to particular countries will sometimes trigger an FBI inquiry. and it shouldn't. I mean, just because someone goes to Pakistan or Afghanistan or wherever, it shouldn't trigger it. But sometimes if you have frequent travel to those countries like Iran, Iraq specifically, Middle Eastern countries, Syria, those will trigger FBI inquiries as well. And then, other times is sometimes they're just following up on something that happened. Here's an example. We had someone who was stopped at the border. They didn't want to turn over their phone to Customs and Border Protection. Finally, Customs and Border Protection showed them the law and said, look, we have the right to do this, blah, blah, blah. She finally did it, and then they looked at her phone, and then she was on her way. But apparently that set off some flags to Customs and Border Protection. They notified FBI. FBI contacted us, said, well, we just want to talk to this person about this incident and, some other things that we've heard some chatter about. So it could be a lot of different sources that bring information into the FBI. But many times it is simply just information finding. It's not that someone is a target or a subject of investigation, is what I've found, at least over the last 6 years. It is typically like they'll want to know what someone's relationship is with you, or like if you've traveled, typically what types of things you did there and who you met with, etc. It's usually along the lines of that type of information gathering, and it's typically very generalized.
So when FBI contacts you, where is the meetup? Would it be at your place, or do you have to go to there?
We always set it up so that the meeting is at our office in downtown Chicago. So if they insist on it being in person, and during 2020 they weren't insisting on it being in person, they were allowing it to be remote. So we could do it remotely via Zoom or some other vehicle. But lately they've been going back to the in-person. And so when it's in person, we insist that it's at our office. We have a conference room when we meet there. We have the client there. I'm there. The agents are there. Unfortunately, they don't allow court reporters there, which would be great because then a court reporter could record everything. They don't allow audio recording or video recording at all. Again, I don't know why, but it would be really helpful for us to be able to do that. So I always request it, but it always gets denied. So, but it's always, we always have it at our office. When we do the meetings, they're always by us.
Okay. There's one more question. I'm sorry. Which provision of the law, which provision of the Bill of Rights is most at risk today due to the current political climate?
That's a good question. There are a lot of them that are attack on multiple fronts. But I think the one that you're going to see in the next year or two coming under most attack is the peaceably assembly part. And, I hate to go back to the Rittenhouse case because there's just so many problems and issues with it. I can't even start. That's a whole nother hour of conversation. But in that particular instance, you had members of the public who were carrying guns to what is supposed to be a peaceable demonstration. So I think what you're going to start seeing is general assemblies and legislatures across the country saying, okay, we're not going to allow this. We're not going to allow people who are armed to partake in these peaceable assemblies under the First Amendment. So that is what that's going to do, though, then, is that's going to trigger a whole round of litigation by people who say that those types of laws infringe on a rock or something. I should be able to fire back and defend myself. So I think that in our current climate right now, especially given the most recent events of January 6th, et cetera, and the marches and the protests we saw last year, I think that is going to be an area that you're going to start seeing some General Assembly start looking at more aggressively. And again, it's something that we as U.S. citizens are going to have to watch, because if they start curbing that ability to peaceably assemble or putting protections on there that limit it only to certain people or certain times or anything like that, that in and of itself is going to cause more protests and rallies, etc. And it should, because that is one of our fundamental rights, is to be able to say, look, the government is doing wrong, or the government has gotten it wrong in this particular area. And this is really the only way that we're able to express ourselves and put this issue out in front of the government and get it in the public eye so that it gets discussed. So I think that probably that particular provision is going to be subject to much more scrutiny and possibly under attack over the next couple of years.
Yeah. That is all the questions that were sent through Facebook. Maron, do you have anything to ask?
I would like to thank you so much, Philip, for giving us the time and for this informative session. I really thank you for this. My question, or my question actually for you is, which resource would you recommend to our audience here to go and learn and educate themselves basically about the Bill of Rights?
There are a lot of really good resources online. It would be hard for me to kind of like pick one or two. But what I would suggest is maybe not so much looking for scholarly things that are about the Bill of Rights, but rather looking to resources that you trust. So finding resources that you trust, and then using those resources to address your questions. There are many sides to each of these debates, and as you can imagine, when it comes to the Bill of Rights, there are hundreds of different interpretations about the way it should be implemented, the way it should be enforced. I mean, the courts themselves have trouble not only discerning how it should be put into practice, but sometimes agreeing about how it should be put into practice. So I advise people, number one, to use sources that they trust, things that they believe are trustworthy sources that they can count on. And number two, use a variety of sources. Don't just go to one source and say, oh, okay, now I know everything about the First Amendment or the Fifth Amendment because I read this guy's scholarly piece about it. Find different resources, maybe even find opposing viewpoints on it, because it helps you get a more well-rounded appreciation for the issue, but it also helps you think more critically about it and discuss it more intelligently when you're out in public. If you only know that one side of it and say, well, this is what Mr. Smith said about the First Amendment, and whatever Mr. Smith said is right, I encourage people to kind of look at it, different opinions, and say, okay, well, that's what Mr. Smith said, but here's what somebody else said, and here's what somebody else said, and then take all those together and then use that kind of as a basis for forming your own opinions about things. And read the news. I think the newspapers are really good sources for seeing how the Bill of Rights today is in action in everything that we do, and all the things that we do publicly and even privately as well. I think the news helps keep us informed as to how these issues are coming about. For example, the whole phone issue. 2 years ago, it was unheard of that they would actually hold your phone and take it and then make a mirror drive copy of it and then send it back to you. That just didn't happen. 2 years ago, they would just simply ask for your password, they'd take a look at it, and then they'd hand it back to you. But that's not the case. Over the last year, we've been seeing more and more of this stuff being detained. And you'll see that in the news. You'll see these stories come up about so-and-so was passing through this airport and they had their laptops taken and they had their phones taken and they were confiscated, and they don't know if they're going to get them back. But just understanding that these are issues that are out there helps prepare you more for if and when, God forbid, that they happen to you.
Great. And I would like to join you here and echo what you said about call CAIR. I would like to
Call
ask
CAIR.
all of our, yeah, absolutely. Call CAIR and ask us if you don't know about your rights, if you don't know if you've been treated very badly or discriminated against at your work, your school, while traveling. We're here. We have about 30 chapter now, CAIR Chicago, CAIR Missouri, CAIR National, and then a lot of other states. So we're here to serve the community.
Right, and it's really important too to make that local contact, because so many of these laws are very local specific. So a lot of times what we see with law enforcement, unfortunately, is there are issues with law enforcement dealing with a particular law or rule or whatever, and then we reach out to law enforcement to make sure it's enforced, and there's no enforcement for members of our community.
Wow.
Members of others communities don't have that problem, don't have that issue. They go into the police department, they want to file a report, or, no problem. They can file a report, the report gets filed, and next thing you know, there's an investigator on it, and a detective is taking a look at everything. But we have so many members of our community where they try and do that, and they just get no cooperation at all from local law enforcement. They just get ignored. And so it's really important to have that local connection, that local contact, that CAIR-Missouri, which is local because they understand the laws, they understand the rules that are local to Missouri, that are specific to Missouri. And so it's very helpful when you're reaching out to law enforcement to say, hey, why aren't you looking into this, to be able to have that local contact and that local connection.
Thank you so much, Philip. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for giving us all this time here to explain the Bill of Rights and the importance of the Bill of Rights to us. And we're looking forward to see you in the future in more events, more sessions.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I actually have one more question. I'm sorry. I promise this is the last one. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh no,
Let us know.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is the question. Well, it's not a question. It's in one word. Can you sum up your opinion about the Rittenhouse verdict?
Yes, I can. You want to know what the word is?
Sure.
Frightening.
Oh yes, definitely.
Frightening.
Wow. Yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So, anything else? Any other questions?
Oh, that was the last one. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thanks for watching.
Thank you so much.
you.
Take care and stay safe and have a good holiday, and we'll talk to you all again very soon.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you very much.
Happy
Appreciate
Thanksgiving.
it.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.